Racism Beyond Cognition, a Lacanian Psychoanalysis of the United States' Terror of and Intimacy with the Other. My name is Johanna Jeung, where I attended Kalamazoo College, having graduated this past year with my Bachelor's of Arts, and this is for the Global Academic Institute's New York conference that would have been in New York in August of 2020. Now, misconceptions of the ontology of racism stem from the oversaturation of how cognitively infrastructured rationality is. And to misconceive of rationality's domain is to feed into the reification of methodological oppression that would otherwise favor a masculinist epistemic contouring, which has historically brutalized those scapegoated for psychic surplus value. Therefore, I am not merely concerned with the idiosyncrasies of racialized bigotry. In fact, I will expand racism beyond rejection. But moreover, I am fearful of the pandemic of cognitive epistemologies. I propose a psychoanalytic model of conceptualizing racism as an intrapsychic structuring of our erotically projected cognitive network. We fantasize out of hysteria, but what we demand, we already have. Racism is not a matter of knowing, but of eroticizing rigid body images. By eroticize, I refer to the pervasivity of libido in our language, anxieties, and agency. While it pervades far beyond intercourse and genitalia, it is precisely this aversion to the sexualized which we must face. There is a nodal point where discourse forms a whole. We make love only to find our own face on our lover. We autonomously indulge only to yearn desperately for the other. Race is because we need this evasion. Being a biracial offspring of immigrants, I am unsatisfied with and habitually injured by cognitive approaches to human desire. I am overwashed by those around me who chase after saying the correct words and performing the correct act, which nonetheless miss the point. To societally embody and thereby eroticize new ways of being, which are neither ahistorical nor arbitrary. If we are to create forgiving, expansive, and participatory coalitions amongst our political community, then we must first gestalt racialized self-images, reassess the subject before the movement. And thus I account for the proliferation of societal psychopathologies beneath the superficiality and hollow nature of what can be known. By shifting from scientific to Lacanian literary paradigm, I switch from racism as cause to racism as meaning. While racism has deep sociological, legal, and material roots undeniably, my goal rather today is to unearth the infrastructure of the psyche that has discursively reified this transitivity. Indeed, racism is a transitivity, not a bigotry. Let us distinguish cognitive from intrapsychic methodologies so that we may better appreciate the Lacanian project. Cognitive methodologies pursue knowledge, questions of how to and what to, a Protestant work ethic, and positional mechanic goals. In contrast, intrapsychic methodologies pursue embodiment and erotic charge, questions about being, a radical openness unto the world, and dilemmas of association and differentiation. Be wary though, because the unconscious is not negative characteristics and thus not unknowable nor unretrievable. While the intrapsychic is the gravitational black hole, the cognitive is the debris, and when we attempt to cognitively quarantine, this repression productively ensues into hegemony nonetheless. But the key Lacanian point is the cognitively accessible reality and the intrapsychic real are distinctly different questions. While cognitive access is necessary for propositional dilemmas, it fails intersubjective affairs. Differentiating these is vital to addressing explosive aggression against and fixation upon the many-faced outsider. These explosions are due to intrapsychic divisions being projected upon the othered in intersubjective social settings. Now, where does racism's volcanicism come from, though? Don't look in the kitchens, don't look in the prisons, don't look in the warehouses or whorehouses or the hood or mosques. We hide away these predicates of our success, and they are processed through shame and violence. Affirmative action policies will not save us from our erotic infrastructure. Divorce is never about the toaster, but what wealth has come to mean for a person, how it protects them, for example. Why should racism be about the bodies, but about what the self-images have come to mean, how they protect a subject? By separating what cannot be cognitively unveiled, the irrational is redeemed as patterns of confrontable causality. Before there can be a successful democratic community, there must be self-suturing and self-garnering subjects. Racial positionality is cognitively processed as either of two forms, essence or illusion. Both have been appropriated for conservative racial projects, growing white supremacy, and for progressive racial projects, diminishing white supremacy. However, both of their cognitive allegiance metatheoretically protect white supremacy by callousing the institutionalized ego talk. The myth of essence argues that race is biological, objective, and fixed so that it is measurable and observable for hierarchical exclusionary classifications. Conservative projects weaponize essence for the nasal indexes, craniology, the one-drop rule, the bird loan system, and other justifications for colonial imperial projects. Contrastingly, progressive racial projects administer essence for the superficiality of diversity through affirmative action policies for institutions and media. This progressive essence has dichotomized white bodies for the egocentrism of allyship. On the other hand, the myth of illusion argues that race is subjective, fluid, and exaggerations we choose to reify. This attempt to make room for agency against the ontological weight of systemic infestation holds faith in the subject's self-awareness and dominion over their psychic infrastructure. Progressive projects digested race as illusion during Obama's presidency, which was believed to be the post-racial cure, only for utter shock to erupt when Trump followed. Progressive projects also appropriate illusion by the weighty hope in a multiracial future, where racist socialization is blanched out of us. Or they suggest we move to the moon or Mars for a fresh start, where this colonialism without a conquered people reminds us of the true colonization, to take back the Hall of Mirrors subject. Conservative racial projects comparatively hold faith in the dissolving of racialized bodies to outshine the immaturity of our prejudices. The only race we are is the human race, so stop calling yourself Black. And yet, Breonna Taylor remains slaughtered. Racism is not about fearing bodies. Racism is not about fleeing bodies. Both essence and illusion forego the discursive genealogy of race. Race as essence holds structuralist faith that signifiers can access the signified, while race as illusion dismisses the separation as arbitrary. Essence is entrapped in redefining race as a matter of stagnant visibilities that can be propositionally quarantined under a transcendental truth. Illusion evaporates these structures as mirages from transsubjectivity. Both fail to recognize the contingency of the science barring. It is this barring that shifts Lacan's beyond Freud's neuroorganic cognitive model to a linguistic intrapsychic model of psychosexual development. Knowledge is not the transsubjective deposit for a macro subject. This emerges as the cosmology that we are not born a racist, with the extraneous few making the hateful, ignorant, or irrational diverges from our inherent acceptance. We presume that we either know someone poorly or inaccurately, that these forms of intolerance derive from a lack of experience with the hated communities. If only they knew them, or that there is a misunderstanding, if only everyone could sit down and communicate it out. By approaching racism as a matter of appropriate language, policies, and positions, we are failing to recognize the cognitive infrastructure that percolates both in obscene and in subtle dilemmas. Race manifests as a cognitively accessible dialectic of structure and ideology due to intrapsychic networks of body image before a transitive mirror. Jacques Lacan proposed a post-structuralist psychoanalytic theory of human identity formation. What does this mean? We are born without borders of differentiation or specialization, and thus all stimuli are of the same ambiguous unity. There is no self separate from the rest of the world as the self is differentiated. However, the body arises, and thus so do our networks of commutation. Psychoanalysis is the unveiling of cognitive infrastructure, internal mechanisms which gravitate the explicit and conscious toward. Cognitive infrastructure is ultimately what codifies our relationships of power and differentiation. Lacan carried on Saussure's linguistic turn, which argued the indivisible barring of the signifier from the signified. While Lacan agreed with the structuralist tradition that all cultural systems can be represented as coded systems of meaning rather than direct transactions with reality, Lacan expanded structuralism beyond a static, closed system of associative networks to an ever-developing and idiosyncratic networks of signifiers dependent on the positionality of the puppeteering subjectivity. But can any one or sign puppeteer the signified? No. And this contingency of the dividing bar between the signifiers and signified is what develops Lacanian psychoanalytic theory as a trove for emancipatory potential. We are committed to the perpetual unfolding of all rationalities, including racism. We are committed to each other. Now, Lacan proposed 3 developmental registers in our psychosexual development: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, eliciting wholeness, body image, and social symbols. The imaginary register and embodiment will be our focus today, though. These can be tools to track interpsychic divisions that are projected onto intersubjective dramas of racism. For Lacan, our relation to reality, is mediated or underwritten by our erotic investment in refinding the self's wholeness, affirming what is like us and denying what is unlike us. Imaginary construction, such as racism, is not merely an unavoidable back and forth between these extremes. Racism is the destabilization of the interpsychic out of anxiety and guilt of our ego formation. Now, in the beginning days, the primary caregiver, the world, and the child's sensations are one and the same. Pleasure is consumed without acknowledgement of boundaries. During the real, we are the closest we will ever be to the pure materiality of reality, where there was no suffering or need, only pure satiation and wholeness. Eventually, however, this will be shattered by the development of body image, but we will attempt to chase this mythic serenity down until death. Throughout our psychosexual development, the real will reemerge but in passing glimmers, resisting representation in language so that the moment we sense it, it will slip through our fingers. It is an excess that is undeniable since we are material beings with bodies, and yet unsymbolizable since development has submerged us in language and representation, which can only make us relations taken to materiality, never materiality itself. The subject can only endlessly misrecognize the original unity. Not only do we mime the other's actions as intentional so that we can grasp our own as expressions of an intentional self, but moreover, we purchase entrance into a symbolic rhetoric. Race is not a matter of confronting an individual, but of confronting a grammar. With repetitive sensations of the flesh, the body image will begin to arise in what Lacan termed the mere phase, with habitual strokings, caresses, and kisses, and dare we think destructive interactions. The body is separated from the clothing, fingers from the arm, etc. While sensation and attention specialize the body, it blooms a cohesive vessel via aestheticization. And this body image may be discovered in a literal mirror, be mirrored in another child, or in the interfacial reality with the primary caregiver. When the child confronts this mirror, these affective echoes are the initial site of ego formation. The encounter with the mirror is fundamentally self-alienating, however. Confronting the mirror is precipitated from insufficiency to anticipation, the subject being caught up in the lure of spatial identification. We look into the mirror and declare ourselves an other. We are caught between hatred, I despise how this image of me is so much better than I am, and love of the image in the mirror. I yearn to be like this image. The initial interactions with the infant's peers or assimilars are characterized by this transitivism of identity. The ego, the image of oneself, acquired in the mirror phase, is a distorting self-image, because in the process of ego formation, one takes an exterior image as oneself. Subjects are installed within an intra-organic mirror, and indeed, mirrors can only be given back the reversed image of our gaze. The body image's rigid armor is a misrecognition of our fragmented body, which overcompensates from our exile from the real. Until the modern age, alas, mirrors remained in possession of merely the elite. The rarity of self-knowledge is, in part, a historical hoarding by the hegemonic. The less hegemonic serve as a crop of psychic surplus value to nourish the ego construction of the symbolic universe. While our subjectivities are united together by the infusion of ego into all of the discovered and conquered bodily structures, the armor's rigidity causes real contortions of the body. Now, when non-white children are raised in white environments, they have clinical difficulty recognizing their bodily qualities. For example, the bodies of Asian American girls are trained to be smaller and take up less space through clothing sizes, diets, and media in order to fulfill their effeminization through orientalization. After confronting the initial mirror, the subject must answer the mirror's many images surrounding them, which number in the millions with the contemporary age of social media, facial recognition, and branding. Thus, the imaginary register is about attempted alignment between images and the fragmented body. In the imaginary register, relations are neither illusory nor non-existent. Rather, they are the establishment of the self-image, where ego is a matter of opposition, same or different. To be too far from nurture, we feel abandoned, but to be too close, we are anxious and feel attacked. This is always a narcissistic relationship in the end. The other is in relation to what we wish to become. Our I will only know our body as a relation to other representations. My body is worse, better than theirs. I am not like their body. It is a narcissism, but the subterranean nature of the unconscious domain discerns it not as a cognitive choice nor belief in the self, no matter the level of malicious harm, so much as it is a desperate attempt to end the loneliness of selfhood. Where our categorization of initial sensations had originally misaligned from the true materiality. The imaginary is viciously volcanic in its ability to erupt both over masturbatory similarity and othering difference, but neither infatuation nor rage are stable modes of being. When we over-identify with the image of the other, the subject becomes dysmorphic to their own material being and will lose themselves in their subservience to the allure. This can be, but need not be, learned coping from the primary caregiving forces oversaturated attention. While fetishism is rarely validated as violence, the leeching of another's self-image, especially if your position with a symbolic network, grants you the dominance to not only leech, but to thieve, not only ultimately destabilizes the leecher's subjectivity and embodiment, but hoards that of the leeched. It is not merely a double consciousness of one life world invading another. Thieving our bodies grants them passage into more of the shared symbolic universe, which they can hysterically refuse to trepidate themselves. The fetishist peels the face off from the leeched subjectivity's skull for their own parading mask. This over-identification with the other can transform into racial fetishism, cultural appropriation, and exoticism. White subjectivities who have been awakened into racial consciousness will often surround themselves with racialized cultures and communities, seeking to affirm their sense of subject as inclusive, diverse, and containing the multitudes of human complexity. Their hysteria over being isolated within their own whiteness is a primordial anxiety from our separation from the real's wholeness. However, on the other hand, the subject can also be disgusted by the image of the other. When the child is abandoned for too long by a primary caregiver, they are debilitated from play. They look out onto the world's metaphorical mirrors and spot a reflection, which they refuse to be like, since it is that which abandoned them. These guttural grotesquities are trained from the beginning of sensation, specialization, and degradation of the infant's materiality. I am boy, not because I am like the multitude of other variations of boy, but because I am not girl. I am a part of this family because I do not belong to all the other families, since I am excluded from their activities and love. I am good, clean, civilized, and intelligent on account of my not being like hood crackheads. Objection is toxic, erupting into rejections of embodiments, both on the level of the individual, racialized body, and on a societal discursion, such as the Asian race. 20th century Asian Americans fought for their own racial category under the law by defining themselves as not Black in a time when resources and rights could only be allocated by a Black-white binary. This Asian American anti-Blackness for model minority respect endures today. The category of American whiteness has shifted to encompass new communities throughout history, but entrance into white supremacy has always been at the cost of rejecting those associated with racialized and rejected signifiers. Abjection and fetishism, though, are not merely anxious responses to psychopathologies. More so, they are hysteric. The split subject is aware of their ego and racial construction because they are intimate with their orchestrating signifier over their quilted associations and differentiations. You know which neighborhoods to walk in, which bodies to shoot down, and yet we cannot bear to gaze our own flesh crawling and are thus frozen in disassociation. It was never about the other's materiality at all. It was never about the slaughtered Jews nor the Black boys. The lived experiences tremble heavy, historical, and systemic, but we must never take this as a direct transaction with reality. Yes, let us be vigilant from history repeating, but this is missing the point. What is it we should truly fear? Not a face, there are no faces. The great outside is the fantasy that conceals the real that is already right here. What is reiterating this need to take distance then? Not only do we rely on a misogynistic lack, we ontologically negate as a reminder of our ideological criticality. Fantasy conceals that the discursive reality is itself leaking, contradictory, and entangled with the real as it is irreducible other side. Fantasy is not falsehoods. It is a house of mirrors. but it is mirrors insofar as it is ontologically. Traverse this hystericism, accept it, chew it, and wield the parameters. Do not accept suffering and oppression, but be prepared that their antithesis will be sewn from the same cloth, and thus we must restructure our questions entirely. Abandon this myth of the racist. Not only are we all born into a system favoring the premature mortality or symbolic leaching of racialized signifiers, we are grammatized to armoring our ego only by our active racialization, by repeating stylized behaviors in order to give the mirage of a stable subject. This must be accepted and taken up if anti-racist education and multiracial solidarity is to unfold. Both conservative and progressive racism fail to care about the other and their particularity. They need only a performative impurity in order to claim adjacency to whiteness. But whiteness has always fled and shifted under historically instituted social constructs. Abandon the subject-centered fight against bigotries. By foregoing propositional knowledge and eroticizing conative meaning, we can form participatory, racially expansive, and forgiving communities which can grow in mutual accountability. Racism is not a bigotry. It is a transitivity. The self is trapped beyond the corpse, and yet this gives no excuse for the violence committed in the name of white comfort and wealth. However, it reorients our tactics. If racism is a failed maintenance of our erotic self-understanding and embodied self-being, we need to dedicate to reordering our conative networks. We must shatter and re-emerge from our rationality if we are to attack racism, not to be hysterical in our self-aware self-butchering, but to gaze beyond the individual into the rhetoric of breath facilitated throughout institutions and interrelations. Actions, speech acts, and habits of democracy befall hollow when emptied of the erotic, while cognitive dissonance will continue to rear its head in even the healthiest democracy, since psyches must remain open to the elusivity of desire as a distance taken from. Anti-racism must never be about correcting the individual, nor affirmative action policies. Praxis can be mined, but which of our associations, differentiations, juxtapositions, and unities scapegoat for inequitable spatiality?